Richard Bennett sat alone in his gleaming black Tesla Model S, drumming his manicured fingers against the leather-wrapped steering wheel. The August heat of suburban Connecticut pressed against the windows, barely kept at bay by the car's whisper-quiet climate control system. At 75 years old, Richard had built his fortune in hedge fund management, transforming himself from a small-town boy into one of Greenwich's most prominent residents. Today, however, his wealth seemed meaningless as he found himself stranded on a quiet back road, miles from his palatial estate in the exclusive Belle Haven neighborhood. The flat tire had caught him off guard, a rare occurrence in a life meticulously planned and controlled. After several frustrated attempts to contact roadside assistance, each call dropping in the spotty coverage area, Richard leaned back in his seat, feeling a foreign sense of helplessness creep in. The perfectly pressed lines of his Tom Ford suit offered little comfort as he watched the sun climb higher in the cloudless sky. Just as the frustration threatened to overwhelm him, a figure appeared in his rearview mirror. Walking with purposeful strides along the sun-dappled road was a young boy, perhaps 13 or 14 years old. His chocolate-brown skin glistened with a light sheen of sweat, and his well-worn Nike t-shirt and scuffed sneakers spoke of modest means. Yet there was something in his bearing, a quiet confidence that caught Richard's attention. The boy approached the car, his keen eyes taking in the situation with remarkable awareness for someone so young. His face broke into a gentle, assured smile as he stopped beside the driver's window. "Looks like you've got yourself in a bit of trouble, sir," he said, his voice carrying a natural warmth that seemed to cut through the morning heat. Richard rolled down his window, surprised by the boy's direct yet courteous approach. "Yes," he admitted, feeling an unusual vulnerability in the admission. "The tire's flat, and I can't seem to get any cell service out here." He gestured helplessly at his latest model iPhone lying useless on the passenger seat. The young man's eyes brightened with purpose. "I can help with that," he said, already moving toward the rear of the car. "My grandfather taught me how to change a tire last summer. He always said, knowing how to fix things is more valuable than knowing how to buy them." There was no boast in his voice, just simple statement of fact. "Do you have a spare?" Richard nodded, pressing the trunk release. He watched in the side mirror as the boy, who moved with the assured confidence of someone twice his age, began gathering the necessary tools. The contrast between his own helplessness and the young man's capability wasn't lost on him, stirring memories of his own humble beginnings that he'd long since buried under decades of wealth accumulation. As the boy worked, Richard found himself studying him more closely. Despite the heat and the physical nature of the task, he maintained a focused demeanor, his movements precise and methodical. There was no complaint about the hot asphalt beneath his knees or the sweat now freely running down his face. Instead, there was only the quiet determination to complete the task at hand. "I'm Marcus," the boy offered without looking up, his hands steadily working the lug wrench. "My mom says it's important to introduce yourself when you're helping someone. Makes them feel more comfortable." The simple wisdom in those words struck Richard deeply, reminding him of countless business meetings where names were traded like currency, each introduction calculated for maximum advantage. When Marcus finished, he rose from the ground, wiping his hands on his jeans with a satisfied nod. The whole operation had taken less than 15 minutes, but to Richard, it felt like he'd witnessed something far more significant than a simple tire change. He reached for his wallet, pulling out several crisp $100 bills. "Please," Richard said, extending the money toward Marcus. "Take this as a thank you for your help." But Marcus took a step back, raising his hand in a polite but firm gesture of refusal. "I appreciate the offer, sir, but that's not why I stopped," he said, his voice carrying a quiet dignity that made Richard's hand falter. Someone needed help, and I could give it. That's all there is to it. With those words, Marcus turned and began walking away, his shoulders straight and his stride unhurried. Richard stood there, money still in hand, watching the boy's figure grow smaller against the backdrop of maple trees lining the road. The bills in his hand suddenly felt weightless, meaningless compared to the weight of the lesson he'd just received. Climbing back into his car, he couldn't shake the image of Marcus's satisfied smile as he completed the tire change, a smile untainted by expectation of reward. That evening, Richard sat in his study, surrounded by the trappings of his success. The room, with its leather-bound books and original artwork, had always been his sanctuary. But tonight, it felt different. The crystal tumbler of 30-year-old scotch sat untouched on his mahogany desk as he stared out the floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking the manicured grounds of his estate. His mind kept returning to Marcus. In all his years of deal-making and wealth accumulation, Richard had encountered thousands of people. Each interaction had been a careful dance of negotiation and mutual benefit. Every relationship measured in terms of what could be gained or lost. But today, a young boy had shattered that worldview with nothing more than a kind heart and willing hands. The contrast between Marcus's worn sneakers and his own Italian leather shoes seemed to represent something deeper, a gulf between the person he'd become and the person he'd once been. Richard remembered his own childhood in a small Pennsylvania town where neighbors helped neighbors without question or expectation. Somewhere along his journey to success, he'd lost touch with that simple truth. Unable to sleep that night, Richard paced the lengthy corridors of his home. Each step echoed off marble floors and past priceless artworks that suddenly seemed to mock him with their emptiness. He couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus had given him something far more valuable than assistance with a flat tire. He'd given him a mirror to see himself clearly for the first time in years. The next morning, driven by an impulse he couldn't quite explain, Richard found himself retracing his route from the previous day. He stopped at local shops and gas stations, describing Marcus to anyone who would listen. Most people shook their heads or offered vague directions until he stepped into a small diner on the outskirts of town. The diner's fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead as an older waitress with graying hair, pulled back in a neat bun, approached his table. As Richard described Marcus, her face lit up with recognition. "Oh, you must be talking about Marcus Washington," she said, adjusting her name tag that read, Betty. "That young man's always helping folks around here. He lives with his mama over in Bridgeport, in the East End neighborhood." She paused, wiping her hands on her apron. "Good people, those two. His mama works 2 jobs to keep them afloat, but you'd never hear them complain." Bridgeport. The name hung in the air like a challenge. The industrial city, just 30 minutes away from his Greenwich mansion, might as well have been on another planet from Richard's usual haunts. He thanked Betty, leaving a generous tip that made her eyes widen, and headed back to his car. The drive to Bridgeport took him through a landscape that changed dramatically with each passing mile. The manicured lawns and high hedges of Greenwich gave way to more modest homes, then to the industrial backdrop of Bridgeport's East End. Following Betty's directions, he found himself on a quiet street lined with small, well-maintained, but aging houses. The Washington home stood out not for its size or grandeur, but for the careful attention evident in its modest appearance. Though the paint was fading and the front steps showed signs of wear, potted plants lined the porch and cheerful curtains hung in the windows. A small American flag fluttered from a bracket near the door, its colors bright against the weathered siding. Richard's hand hesitated for a moment before knocking. What was he doing here? What would he say? Before he could second-guess himself further, the door opened to reveal a woman in her early 40s. Despite the evident fatigue in her eyes, she carried herself with the same quiet dignity he'd noticed in Marcus. She wore scrubs from what appeared to be a medical facility and a name tag identifying her as Sarah Washington, CNA. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice carrying a mix of curiosity and caution. "Good morning, Mrs. Washington," Richard began, suddenly feeling uncertain despite his decades of boardroom confidence. "I met your son Marcus yesterday. He helped me with a flat tire, and I wanted to thank him properly." Sarah's face softened immediately, a proud smile warming her features. "That sounds like my Marcus," she said, stepping aside to welcome him in. "He's out back working on our neighbor's fence. Mrs. Johnson's arthritis has been acting up, and Marcus insisted on helping." The interior of the home was modest but immaculate. Family photos lined the walls showing Marcus at various ages, holding up science fair ribbons, posing in a Little League uniform, standing proudly next to an elderly man Richard assumed was his grandfather. Each image told a story of love, determination, and community that made Richard's throat tighten unexpectedly. Sarah led him through the house to the backyard, where Marcus was indeed hard at work, carefully replacing damaged boards in the neighboring fence. The boy looked up, surprise flickering across his face, before being replaced by a genuine smile. "Mr. Bennett," he said, setting down his hammer, "I didn't expect to see you again." Richard found himself smiling back, struck by the boy's natural ease. "I wanted to thank you properly," he explained. "What you did yesterday, it meant more than you know." Marcus shrugged, but his eyes showed he understood the weight of the moment. "Like I said, sir, helping others is just what we do around here. My grandpa always said, wealth isn't about what's in your wallet. It's about what's in your heart." The wisdom in those words hit Richard like a physical force. He looked around the modest backyard, taking in the carefully tended vegetable garden, the old but well-maintained tools, and the worn basketball hoop mounted above the garage. Everything spoke of care, resourcefulness, and pride. "Would you stay for lunch?" Sarah asked, breaking into his thoughts. "It's nothing fancy, just some homemade chicken soup and fresh bread, but you're welcome to join us." Richard's first instinct was to politely decline. He had business meetings, calls to return. But something made him pause. When was the last time he'd had a meal that wasn't at a high-end restaurant or prepared by his personal chef? "I'd be honored," he found himself saying, and he meant it. The kitchen was small but warm and inviting, filled with the aroma of home cooking. The table was set with mismatched plates and simple flatware. But there was more genuine welcome here than at any of the formal dinner parties Richard had hosted in recent memory. As they ate, the conversation flowed naturally. Marcus talked about his dreams of becoming an engineer, his eyes lighting up as he described the robotics club he'd joined at school. Sarah spoke of her work at the nursing home, the challenges and rewards of caring for others. Richard found himself sharing stories of his own humble beginnings, memories he hadn't revisited in years. "You've done an amazing job with him," Richard said to Sarah as they cleared the dishes together. "Marcus has a spirit about him that's rare these days." Sarah's eyes misted slightly. "We've had our struggles," she admitted, "but we've always had each other and our community. Sometimes that's worth more than any amount of money." Driving home that evening, Richard felt a clarity of purpose he hadn't experienced in decades. The next morning, he began making calls. His network of business connections, built over 40 years in finance, sprang into action. Within days, contractors, suppliers, and workers were lined up, ready to transform the Washington home. When the trucks first arrived, Sarah and Marcus stood on their porch in disbelief. "Mr. Bennett," Sarah started, her voice trembling. This is too much. We can't accept—" "Please," Richard interrupted gently. "You and Marcus have given me something priceless. A reminder of what truly matters in life. Let me give something back." Over the next month, the modest house underwent a complete transformation. The aging roof was replaced, the electrical system updated, and energy-efficient windows installed throughout. The kitchen received modern appliances while maintaining its warm, welcoming atmosphere. Outside, the old basketball hoop was replaced with a new one, and the backyard was transformed with a proper workshop space where Marcus could work on his projects. But Richard's help didn't stop at physical improvements. Learning of Marcus's passion for engineering, he established a college fund and arranged for the boy to attend summer engineering programs at Yale. He also helped Sarah enroll in nursing school, allowing her to pursue her dream of becoming a registered nurse while maintaining just one job instead of two. Marcus, true to his nature, couldn't resist getting involved in the renovation work. The contractors, won over by his genuine interest and quick mind, took him under their wing. Tom, the lead carpenter, spent hours teaching Marcus about construction principles, turning the renovation into an impromptu engineering lesson. "You've got a natural talent for this, kid," Tom would say, watching Marcus calculate angles and measure cuts with precise care. "You're going to make one hell of an engineer someday." As the weeks passed, Richard found himself spending more and more time at the Washington home. He'd arrive early in the morning with coffee for the workers and stay through lunch, often joining Sarah and Marcus for simple meals that somehow tasted better than any five-star restaurant he'd ever visited. The transformation wasn't just in the house. Richard could feel himself changing too. The sharp-edged business titan was softening, rediscovering parts of himself he'd thought long lost. He found himself laughing more, worrying less about his stock portfolio, and feeling a deep satisfaction that no business deal had ever provided. On the day the renovation was completed, the entire neighborhood turned out to celebrate. The small street was filled with people bringing food, offering congratulations, and sharing in the joy of the moment. Richard watched as Marcus proudly showed his friends the new workshop, his enthusiasm infectious. Sarah approached Richard as he stood observing the scene. "You've done more than fix a house," she said softly, her eyes glistening. "You've given us hope, a future. But I think you've found something too, haven't you?" Richard nodded, feeling an unfamiliar warmth in his chest. "I spent my life chasing success," he admitted. "But I think I finally understand what real wealth looks like. It's not in bank accounts or stock portfolios. It's in connections, in kindness, in the ability to make a difference in someone's life." Marcus joined them, his face glowing with happiness. "Mr. Bennett," he said thoughtfully, "remember when you tried to pay me for changing your tire? I think I understand now why you did that. But I also think you understand now why I couldn't take the money." Richard put his hand on Marcus's shoulder, emotion making his voice rough. "You taught me more in that one act of kindness than I learned in 40 years of business, Marcus. Never lose that spirit." As the sun set over Bridgeport that evening, casting long shadows across the renovated house, Richard realized that this wasn't an ending, but a beginning. He had found a new purpose, a new family, and a new understanding of what it meant to be truly rich. In the years that followed, Richard became a regular fixture in the Washington household and the neighborhood. He established a community foundation to help other families in need, with Marcus and Sarah serving on the board. The foundation's mission was simple: to foster the same spirit of kindness and community that had changed Richard's life that summer day. And so, a simple act of kindness from a young boy not only transformed a house and changed lives, but also reminded an old man of life's most valuable lesson, that true wealth isn't measured in dollars and cents, but in the lives we touch and the love we share